In the
told
midst
you
of
to
a
wait
quiet
outside.
evening,
You are
the
causing a
expansive
disturbance.
mansion stood still, bathed
How
in the
dare
soft
you
glow
look at
of
my
the
child?
golden
We need a doctor
chandeliers.
immediately.
The sound of clinking glasses and light chatter echoed faintly through the halls. Inside, billionaire Thomas Anderson, a man used to making decisions with the precision of a surgeon, was lounging in his study. His mind was preoccupied with the ongoing negotiations for his latest business venture. He picked up a glass of aged whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light, when a sudden sound broke the tranquility. A voice, a whisper, but filled with desperation. "Please, save my brother." The words pierced the air, slicing through the noise of his thoughts like a knife. Thomas paused, his fingers gripping the glass so tightly it almost slipped from his hand. His heart skipped a beat. The voice came from outside, faint but distinct. He walked toward the window, pulling the heavy curtains aside to reveal the snowy driveway. There, standing just beyond the gates, was a young girl. Her clothes were ragged, and her face was streaked with tears. But what caught Thomas's attention was the look in her eyes: fear, pain, and an unwavering determination. "Please, save my brother," she repeated, her voice quivering. Thomas's mind raced. What could this girl possibly want from him? Why come here, to his home, and make such a bold plea? He stood motionless, a mix of disbelief and confusion flooding his senses. The evening seemed to freeze around him. The girl was still there, staring up at him, as if waiting for him to act. He put down his glass slowly, his heart beginning to race. Was this a prank? A test? He stepped away from the window and walked toward the front door, his mind spinning with questions. He opened the door slowly, and there she was standing at the foot of his stairs, clutching a worn backpack. "My brother is hurt," she said, her words barely audible over the wind. "He's lying on the street. I don't know what to do." Her hands trembled as she held out a crumpled piece of paper, one that looked like it had been scribbled on hastily. Thomas could barely make out the address, but the urgency in her voice was undeniable. His instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The cold hit him immediately, biting at his skin. He glanced down at the girl again. She was shaking from the cold, but there was no sign of hesitation in her eyes. "Take me to him," he said, his voice firm, though he couldn't fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face as she turned and began walking quickly, her small frame darting through the snow. Thomas followed, his mind still reeling. Who was this girl? And who was her brother? All he knew was that he couldn't ignore her plea. As they moved deeper into the night, the sound of their footsteps was the only thing that broke the eerie silence. Thomas's heart was pounding now, but he pushed aside the questions swirling in his mind. There was no time for doubt. He had to act. The world around him seemed to fade into the background as he focused on the urgency of the moment, wondering what he was about to find. What was waiting for him at the end of this strange journey? The answer seemed just out of reach, but he was determined to find it. Thomas followed the girl through the snow, his footsteps crunching loudly in the otherwise quiet night. The cold wind whipped through the empty streets, but he barely felt it. His mind was consumed with the girl's words, "Please, save my brother." He could still hear the desperation in her voice. He glanced down at her, seeing how small and fragile she looked against the vast, dark landscape. Her clothes were thin, and she was visibly shivering, but she walked quickly, almost determined, as though nothing could slow her down. It didn't make sense. Why would she come to him for help? A billionaire with no connection to her, with no reason to get involved. But here she was, looking to him for salvation. He tried to shake the thoughts from his head, but they lingered, pulling at him. She had been so certain, so convinced that he could make a difference. The girl turned onto a narrow street that Thomas didn't recognize. The houses were smaller here, tucked away from the main roads. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. She stopped in front of a rundown house and pointed toward the curb. "He's over there," she said, her voice quiet, almost breaking. Thomas's stomach tightened. He could see the outline of a figure lying on the ground in front of the house. His heart raced, and his thoughts scattered. "What happened to him?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but he couldn't ignore the panic rising in his chest. The girl looked down, her face pale in the dim light. "He was attacked. Some kids. They hit him with a bat, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. He's bleeding. He's not waking up. Thomas's throat tightened as he walked toward the figure. The street was eerily silent except for the sound of his footsteps and the soft sound of the girl's sobs behind him. As he reached the body, he crouched down, his breath visible in the frigid air. The boy lying on the pavement was unconscious, blood staining the snow beneath him. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he checked for a pulse. It was faint but steady. He let out a breath of relief, though it was short-lived. The boy's condition was serious, and he knew they needed help. "We need to get him to a hospital," Thomas said, standing up and looking around. "Stay here. I'll get the car." The girl shook her head quickly. "No, they'll catch him. They'll hurt him again. Please, you have to help him. Now." Her voice was desperate, pleading. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. The snow was falling harder now, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The girl was right. Time was running out. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "We'll take him somewhere safe. I won't leave him." The girl nodded, her expression softening slightly. He lifted the boy carefully, trying not to jostle him too much, and the girl led the way, her small feet barely making a sound in the snow. The journey to the car felt like an eternity, and Thomas could feel the weight of the boy in his arms growing heavier with each step. His mind was a blur of questions and emotions, but the only thing that mattered was getting the boy to safety. When they finally reached the car, Thomas opened the door and gently placed the boy in the back seat. He turned to the girl, who was standing in the snow, still shivering. "Get in. I'll take you both somewhere warm," he said, his voice soft but firm. The girl didn't hesitate this time. She climbed into the car and settled beside the boy, her eyes locked on him as if afraid he might disappear if she looked away. Thomas started the engine, and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet street behind. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl's words. "Please, save my brother." It was a simple plea, but it had changed everything. Thomas had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not after hearing her cry for help. The city blurred past them, lights flashing in the distance, but inside the car, there was only the sound of their breaths and the soft rustling of the girl's jacket as she shifted beside the boy. Thomas focused on the road ahead, trying to push aside the chaos in his mind. There would be time to think later. For now, all he could do was drive and hope that they would get there in time. The car sped through the quiet streets, the city lights casting fleeting shadows on the windows. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror, his mind racing. The girl was still holding her brother's hand, her face pale with worry, her small form huddled in the back seat. She had not said a word since they left the scene, but her eyes were locked on the boy, her expression a mix of fear and hope. Thomas's heart tightened as he watched her, knowing there was little time left. The boy's breathing was shallow, and his pulse was weak, but at least he was still alive. Thomas turned the corner onto a busy street and drove past the flashing signs and storefronts, his thoughts scattered. How could this happen? How could a young girl end up in such a desperate situation, relying on a stranger for help? And why had she come to him? The questions gnawed at him, but he didn't have time to figure it out. His focus shifted back to the road. He needed to get them to safety. "We're almost there," Thomas said, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice was strained. The girl nodded without looking up. He took another turn, heading toward a private clinic on the outskirts of the city. It was small but well-equipped, far enough from the chaos of downtown to offer some semblance of privacy. The clinic was always open, and Thomas knew the staff would be able to handle an emergency like this. He hoped. "Can you tell me your name?" Thomas asked, glancing at the girl again. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers still gripping her brother's hand tightly. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lily," Thomas repeated, as if testing the name. It felt strange to him, knowing so little about this girl, yet feeling like he had to protect her and her brother. "Lily, I'm going to do everything I can to help him. We'll get him fixed up, I promise." She didn't respond, but her eyes shifted slightly, a glimmer of gratitude flickering in them. They finally reached the clinic. Thomas parked the car in front and quickly got out, running around to open the back door. He gently lifted the boy, who was still unconscious, cradling him in his arms. Lily followed behind, her steps quick but shaky, as if she was afraid that something might happen if she stopped moving. "Come on," Thomas said softly, glancing at her. "Stay close." Together, they rushed into the clinic. The receptionist, who recognized Thomas immediately, stood up in surprise. "Mr. Anderson, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "He's been attacked," Thomas replied, his voice tight with urgency. "Get the doctor now." The receptionist quickly nodded and dashed into the back, while Thomas and Lily waited in the sterile white-walled lobby. Thomas felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He glanced down at the boy in his arms, his mind racing. How did this happen? Who would hurt a kid like him? And why had Lily been left to deal with it alone? A few moments later, a doctor came rushing into the lobby, followed by 2 nurses. They quickly took the boy from Thomas's arms and wheeled him into the emergency room. Lily stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't move, as if afraid to let go of the moment. Thomas walked over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's in good hands," he said softly, trying to offer reassurance. Lily didn't respond, but she seemed to relax slightly, her shoulders no longer as tense. "We'll find out what happened," Thomas continued, "and we'll make sure he gets the care he needs." Lily finally looked up at him, her face still pale but with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded, unsure of what to say. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice low. "We'll figure this out together." He stepped back, letting the staff take over as they worked on the boy. He watched for a moment, the noise of the medical equipment and the steady rhythm of the doctor's movements filling the room. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of life this little girl had led, what had brought her to his doorstep, pleading for help. The questions still lingered, but for now, there was nothing he could do but wait. He turned to Lily, who was still standing by the door, her eyes fixed on the emergency room. "You're safe now," he said. "He's going to be okay." Lily nodded slowly, though her eyes remained uncertain. Thomas didn't know how long it would take to get the answers he needed, but he did know one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave her, not until he figured out how to help them both. Thomas stood by the door of the emergency room, his eyes fixed on Lily. She had not moved from her spot since the nurses rushed her brother away. Her small form was hunched over, her hands clasped tightly together as she waited for any word. Thomas could see the fear written all over her face. He felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had promised her he would help, but he still had so many unanswered questions. What had happened to her brother? Why was she alone? Who had hurt him? His mind raced as he paced back and forth in the sterile hallway, the silence only broken by the occasional beep of the machines and the rustle of nurses' shoes on the tile floor. He returned to Lily's side, kneeling down to her level. "Lily," he said softly, trying to catch her attention. She looked up, her eyes red from crying. "How is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas didn't know what to say. The truth was, they still hadn't figured out the extent of her brother's injuries. The doctors were working quickly, but it was clear that the situation was dire. "They're doing everything they can," Thomas said, trying to sound confident. "He's in good hands. The doctors are the best around." Lily nodded, but her gaze didn't waver from the door to the emergency room. She was biting her lip, her body tense. Thomas couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for her and her brother. He had no idea what had brought them here, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now, not after seeing her so vulnerable, pleading for help. "Lily," Thomas began again, his voice gentler this time. "You don't have to worry. We'll figure out what happened. I'm going to make sure you're safe. You and your brother both." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him with those wide, fearful eyes, as though searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe hope. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke. "They said they were just trying to teach him a lesson. They didn't mean to hurt him. I don't know why they did it." Her voice cracked as she said the words, and Thomas felt his heart ache. It didn't make sense. A lesson? What kind of lesson was worth this? He couldn't imagine what Lily had been through, watching her brother get hurt and then having to find a stranger to help. "Who did this to him?" Thomas asked gently, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Lily looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "It was the kids from the school," she whispered. The ones who always pick on him. They told him he wasn't good enough, that he didn't belong with them. Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, all Thomas could hear was the faint hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would make her feel better, but there were no words. I don't understand, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would they do that? Because he's different, Lily replied, her voice shaking. He's not like them. He doesn't look like them. He doesn't talk like them. Her words hit him hard. Thomas had been so focused on the immediate situation, the urgency of getting her brother help, that he hadn't even thought about why they were in this situation in the first place. Lily's brother was being bullied. And now, he was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life because of it. Thomas felt a fire ignite in his chest. He had spent his whole life building his empire, making money, but none of that had ever made him feel like this. He had never felt the kind of anger that burned inside him now. He had never wanted to protect someone so badly. He looked at Lily, who was still standing there, her small shoulders hunched under the weight of the world. You're safe now, Lily, Thomas said, his voice steady. You're both safe. I won't let anyone hurt you again. Lily didn't respond, but she looked up at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas stood up, his resolve firm. He would find out who had hurt her brother, and he would make sure they paid for it. He couldn't undo the pain they had caused, but he could make sure it didn't happen again. He couldn't imagine what Lily and her brother had been through, but he was determined to help them through it. Just then, the doctor came out of the emergency room, his face grim. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. How is he? Thomas asked, stepping forward. The doctor sighed, looking at Thomas with a solemn expression. He's stable for now, the doctor said, but we're not out of the woods yet. He's lost a lot of blood, and there's significant trauma. We're doing everything we can, but it's going to be a long road. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He nodded, unable to say anything. The doctor gave him a brief nod before turning to Lily. You can see him now, but only for a moment, the doctor said gently. Lily nodded quickly and rushed past Thomas, heading toward the room where her brother was being treated. Thomas watched her go, feeling a mixture of pride and helplessness. He had promised to protect them both, and now he had to keep that promise. He turned and walked toward the receptionist, his mind already planning his next move. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone hurt this family again. Thomas sat in the waiting room, his hands clenched tightly together. He couldn't stop thinking about Lily and her brother, about everything they had been through. The silence around him was overwhelming, and with every passing minute, his mind raced with the possibility of what might happen next. The doctor had said her brother was stable for now, but that didn't reassure Thomas. The trauma was severe, and there was still so much unknown. He had seen enough to know that the boy wasn't out of danger. The door to the emergency room opened, and the doctor walked out, his face a mask of professionalism. He took a breath before addressing Thomas, who stood up immediately. He's still unconscious, but we've managed to stop the bleeding, the doctor said, his voice calm but serious. We're monitoring his vitals, but the next 24 hours are critical. His recovery will depend on how he responds. Thomas nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. He wanted to ask more questions, but the doctor's words were enough. There was a chance, but it was a fragile one. The doctor glanced at Lily, who was sitting by the door, waiting quietly, her face pale and drawn. You can see him now, the doctor added softly, but only for a few minutes. He's not awake yet, and we don't want to overwhelm him. Lily immediately stood up, her eyes filled with determination. She didn't say anything but walked past Thomas and the doctor toward the room where her brother lay. Thomas watched her, his heart heavy with concern. This little girl had already been through so much. It wasn't just her brother who had been hurt. She had been hurt too. He could see the weight of everything on her shoulders, the burden of taking care of someone when she should have been the one being cared for. Thomas's thoughts drifted to his own life, his own wealth, his empire, and how insignificant it all felt in this moment. None of that mattered now. What mattered was this family, this little girl who had trusted him enough to ask for help. What kind of person would he be if he turned his back on them now? He knew he couldn't walk away, not after everything that had happened. He walked over to the receptionist and asked, "Is there a way to find out who did this to them?" The receptionist looked up at him, her expression sympathetic but hesitant. "I'm not sure," she said, "but I can put you in touch with the police. They've been informed, and they'll likely start their investigation soon." Thomas nodded, but he didn't feel comforted. The police would do their part, but he wanted to act. He wanted to find out who was responsible, and he wanted them to face the consequences of their actions. His thoughts were interrupted by Lily's soft voice. She was standing in the doorway, looking up at him. "He's still asleep," she said quietly. "But he's going to be okay, right?" Her eyes were hopeful, but Thomas could see the doubt beneath the surface. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice steady, though his mind was anything but calm. "He's going to be okay." He didn't know if that was true, but he had to say it. Lily seemed to relax a little, though her shoulders remained tense. She stepped back into the room with her brother, and Thomas stood there, watching her for a moment. She was so young, yet she had already been forced to grow up too quickly. Thomas's mind raced. How could people be so cruel? To target a child, to hurt someone for no reason at all. He thought back to Lily's words earlier, about the bullies at her brother's school, the ones who had taunted him for being different, the ones who had made him believe he didn't belong. It made him sick. He had built his wealth on the idea of merit, of earning your place in the world, but what did any of that mean when people were treated like this? He couldn't stand it. He wouldn't stand for it. Thomas walked over to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew he couldn't sit back and let this go unpunished. He would find those responsible, and he would make sure they understood the weight of their actions. He didn't care who they were. They had hurt an innocent child, and that was something he couldn't forgive. A few moments later, Lily returned to the waiting area, her expression guarded. She didn't look at Thomas but walked past him, taking a seat in the corner. Her brother was still in the same condition, but she had stayed by his side, her presence a silent promise that she wouldn't leave him, no matter what. Thomas sat down across from her, his mind racing. He needed answers. He needed to find out who had hurt this family, and he needed to do it quickly. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. Lily looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "Thank you for helping us," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Thomas met her gaze, his voice firm but kind. "You don't have to thank me, Lily. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to make sure you both get the justice you deserve." Lily nodded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. Thomas didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to rest until the people who had hurt her brother paid for what they did. He stood up, looking at Lily. "I'm going to make a few calls. I'll be back soon." Lily gave him a small, grateful smile, and he walked out of the waiting room, his determination growing stronger with every step. He was going to find out who was responsible, and he was going to make them pay. Iris, the night nurse, dimmed the hallway lights as the clock crept closer to midnight, and the soft hum of medical machines filled the quiet clinic. Thomas returned to the waiting area after making several calls, though none of them brought the answers he wanted. He had spoken with private security experts, school officials, and even a lawyer he trusted, but all he got were fragments, possibilities, and excuses. Nothing solid. Nothing that explained why a young boy had been beaten in a neighborhood where no one claimed to have seen anything. Lily sat on a stiff clinic chair, her knees pulled up, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she was trying to hold in all the fear and pain she had been carrying. She was awake, but her eyes were heavy, not with sleep but with exhaustion. Thomas approached her slowly, not wanting to scare her. "Lily," he said softly, and she looked up, startled at first but then relieved to see him. "I talked to a few people," Thomas continued, lowering himself to sit across from her. "I am trying to understand what happened, but I need your help. Can you tell me more about your brother, and about the boys who did this?" Lily hesitated. She stared down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. Her voice was small when she finally spoke. "His name is Aaron," she whispered. "He is 9 years old. He is quiet. He does not bother anybody. He just likes to read." The way she said it made something twist in Thomas's chest. Lily took a breath, steadying herself. The boys at school used to push him around. They made fun of him because he is small, and because we do not have new clothes like they do. They said he did not belong there. They said people like us should stay away. She stopped, her throat tightening as she fought to keep her composure. We always walk home together, Lily continued, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. But today I had to stay after class. When I got outside, they were already surrounding him. They said they were just playing, but they were not playing. They were hurting him. Thomas had to look away for a moment, not because he did not want to hear it, but because he wanted to control the anger building inside him. He could feel it rising, hot and sharp, but he knew he could not let Lily see that. She had seen enough fear for one day. "You did the right thing by coming to me," he said gently. "You were very brave." Lily shook her head. "I did not know what else to do. Nobody else would help. People walked by, but they looked away." Her words cut like glass. Thomas felt something heavy settle in his chest. How many times had he walked past someone in need, telling himself that someone else would take care of it? How many times had he assumed problems like this did not concern him? Lily blinked up at him, her eyes full of sincerity. "When I saw your house, I thought, maybe someone like you could help." "I know it sounds silly." Thomas reached out, not touching her but placing his hand on the armrest near her so she could see it. "It is not silly," he said. "It is very smart, and it brought you here, which means your brother has a chance." For the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of Lily's mouth. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. She opened her worn backpack, the zipper sticking halfway. Inside, she pulled out something wrapped in a folded grocery bag. She held it out to him with both hands. "This is his notebook," she said quietly. "He writes in it every day. Maybe it can help you understand him." Thomas took the notebook carefully. It was old, with creases on the edges and faint pencil marks smudged on the cover. He opened it slowly and saw drawings, small sketches full of imagination. Superheroes, spaceships, big dreams on tiny pieces of paper. There were also words, simple sentences, thoughts written in a child's handwriting. On one page, Thomas read, "I want to be brave like Lily. She always protects me." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He closed the notebook gently and handed it back to Lily. "Thank you," he said softly. "This tells me everything I need to know." Lily hugged the notebook to her chest, closing her eyes for a moment. Thomas leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had entered this night thinking it would be ordinary. A drink, a quiet evening, a moment to breathe. But now he knew this night would change everything. Not just for Lily and her brother, but for him too. He looked toward the hallway that led to the room where Aaron was fighting to recover. Then he looked back at Lily, who was watching him with cautious hope. "Lily," he said, his voice steady, full of resolve, "I promise you this. I am going to help your brother, and I am going to make sure the people who hurt him are held accountable. You are not alone anymore." And for the first time since the night began, Lily's eyes glimmered with something more than fear. They glimmered with trust. The next morning, Thomas stood in his office, staring out the large windows that overlooked the city. The skyscrapers in the distance seemed like distant giants, cold and indifferent, just like the world that had allowed Lily and her brother to suffer in silence for so long. He clenched his fists at his sides. No more. He couldn't just let this go. He had promised Lily he would help, and he intended to make good on that promise, no matter what it took. He had made calls, reached out to people. He had even spoken to a private investigator, but the more he dug into the situation, the murkier it became. The bullies at the school had a history of causing trouble, but there was little the authorities could do unless the parents pressed charges, and Lily's family, from what he could gather, didn't have the resources to fight back. Thomas rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling inside him. He had built his success on being able to control outcomes. This was different. This was messy, but that didn't matter now. He needed answers. He turned away from the window and picked up his phone, dialing the number for the investigator he had hired. "Mr. Anderson." The voice on the other end answered quickly. "What can I do for you?" "I need you to find out who was responsible for the attack on Aaron," Thomas said, his voice sharp. "Get me names. I want to know who's behind this and what their history is. Everything. And I want it now." There was a brief silence. "Understood, Mr. Anderson. I'll get started right away." "Good. Keep me posted," Thomas said, ending the call. He felt a flicker of relief knowing that at least he was doing something. But he couldn't stop thinking about Lily and Aaron. They needed justice, and they needed it now. He walked across the room, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle this. It wasn't just about finding the bullies and holding them accountable. It was about sending a message that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. He couldn't let it slide. Not when he knew how easy it was for the powerful to hide behind their privilege while the weak suffered in silence. As he sat back at his desk, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the lawyer he had called earlier that morning. "Mr. Anderson, I've spoken to the local authorities. The school is aware of the situation, but it seems they're hesitant to act without full cooperation from the parents. I'll reach out to them and see if they're willing to pursue legal action." Thomas read the message twice. He didn't need anyone's permission to do what was right. He wouldn't wait for the school or anyone else to make a decision. He was going to take matters into his own hands. He typed a quick reply. "Do what you need to do. Keep me in the loop." He put the phone down, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. The phone rang again, and this time it was Lily's voice on the other end. "Mr. Anderson?" she said softly. "I just wanted to thank you again. For everything." Thomas could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She was still unsure, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. He could understand that. "You don't need to thank me, Lily," he said, his voice gentle. "You and Aaron are not alone anymore. I'm not going anywhere." There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice filled with vulnerability. "I'm scared. What if they hurt him again? What if it's too late?" Her words hit him hard. He knew the fear she was carrying, the uncertainty of whether Aaron would survive this, whether they would ever find peace. "It's not too late," Thomas said, his voice steady. "You're both going to be okay. I promise." He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew he wouldn't stop until he had answers. He wouldn't stop until Aaron was safe. And he wouldn't stop until those responsible paid for what they had done. Lily didn't say anything else, but he could hear the quiet relief in her breathing. "Thank you," she whispered, and the line went silent. Thomas sat back in his chair, the weight of what he had just promised settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about protecting a family that had been broken by the cruelty of others. He would fight for them. He would fight for Lily and Aaron. And if anyone tried to stop him, they would have to go through him first. Thomas had built his empire by standing firm, by refusing to back down when it mattered most. And now, it mattered more than ever. He leaned forward, grabbing the phone again. "It's time to make things right," he muttered to himself. He began typing another message, this one to the private investigator, with a simple instruction: "Get me everything on these kids. Everything." It was only a matter of time now. Soon, the truth would come to light, and when it did, there would be no escape for those who had hurt Aaron. Thomas was ready, and he was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. The morning light streamed through the windows of the hospital waiting room, casting long shadows on the floor. Thomas stood by the window, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had spent the entire night tracking down leads, calling in favors, and speaking to anyone who might have information about the boys who had attacked Aaron. His mind was spinning, but he couldn't stop now. He couldn't back down. Lily and Aaron were counting on him. He looked down at his phone when it buzzed. It was a message from the private investigator. "I've got names. I've spoken to a few of the students who were in the area the night Aaron was attacked. I've got 3 main suspects. I'll send you their details." Thomas's heart raced as he read the message. Finally, they were getting somewhere. He tapped his finger on the phone screen, responding quickly. "Get me everything you can. Background checks, connections, anything." He felt a surge of urgency. The school might not be able to act quickly enough, but he wasn't going to wait. These kids needed to be held accountable. A moment later, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from his lawyer. "Thomas," the voice on the other end said, "I've been talking to the local authorities, and we've got an update on the case. They're willing to press charges against the boys if we move forward. but we need more evidence. They need to see a clear connection between the attackers and the injuries. And we need the school's cooperation. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. I'll make sure the school cooperates, he said firmly. I'll handle that. He wasn't about to let the school sweep this under the rug. He had the power to make things happen, and he wasn't going to back down. I've also found out something else, the lawyer continued. It looks like the boys who attacked Aaron might come from well-connected families. We're talking about high-profile parents who might try to shut this whole thing down before it even gets started. Thomas's mind started to race again. This was exactly what he feared. The powerful, the wealthy people like him had a way of making problems disappear. But not this time, not on his watch. I don't care who their parents are, Thomas said coldly. If they hurt a child, they will be held responsible. I will not let this go. He hung up the phone and walked over to the waiting room door. His mind was already processing the next steps. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. He had the power to get things done, and he wasn't going to wait for anyone else to take action. He stepped out into the hallway, his eyes scanning for Lily. She was sitting in a corner, looking small and fragile as she clutched Aaron's notebook tightly against her chest. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, her eyes full of hope and uncertainty. Mr. Anderson? She asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you have any news? Thomas nodded, his expression steady. Yes, I do. We've got names. We've got leads. I'm going to make sure the people who did this to Aaron face the consequences of their actions. Lily's eyes widened, and for the first time in what felt like days, a small smile flickered across her face. You're really going to help us? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. I'm not going anywhere, Lily, Thomas said, his voice unwavering. I gave you my word, and I'm going to keep it. I'm going to make sure Aaron is safe, and I'm going to make sure those who hurt him are held accountable. You and your brother deserve justice, and I'm going to make sure you get it. Lily took a deep breath, her shoulders finally relaxing for the first time since the attack. She stepped forward, looking up at him with a mixture of gratitude and hope in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Thank you for everything. Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. You don't have to thank me. You and Aaron are family now, and I'm going to make sure you both get the future you deserve. He turned, his mind focused on what needed to be done. There was no time to waste. The investigation was just beginning. But Thomas knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. He had already seen how easily the system could turn its back on people like Lily and Aaron, but he wasn't going to let that happen. He would use every resource at his disposal to make sure the truth came to light. He wasn't just fighting for Lily and Aaron anymore. He was fighting for what was right. He walked out of the waiting room, heading straight for the elevators. The private investigator would have the information he needed soon, and then it would be time to take action. No more waiting, no more excuses. This fight was just getting started. The day after his conversation with Lily, Thomas found himself pacing back and forth in his office. His mind raced with the information he had received. The private investigator had provided names, and while he couldn't yet confirm everything, there were enough leads to start building a case. The parents of the boys who had attacked Aaron were influential businessmen, attorneys, people who had connections in high places. Thomas had expected this, but it didn't change the resolve he felt deep in his bones. If they thought their influence could shield them, they were wrong. He wouldn't let this go. As Thomas stood there, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his lawyer. Thomas, we have a breakthrough. I spoke to the school's administration. They are finally willing to cooperate. They are reviewing the footage from the security cameras and trying to pinpoint who was involved. I'll send you the information as soon as it's available. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. He knew the school was only doing this because they had no choice. They were under pressure, and now that the media was starting to catch wind of the case, they were scrambling to cover their tracks. He didn't trust them, but it was a start. At least now, the school was on the record, and they were working to bring the truth to light. Thomas typed a quick reply. Good. Get the footage to me as soon as you can. Let me know if you need anything from my side. He hit send and put the phone down. As he stared out the window, he could hear the faint hum of the city below. The world outside was moving forward, but here he was, stuck in a battle for justice, not just for Aaron and Lily, but for something much bigger. He was fighting to hold the powerful accountable, to make sure that no one else could ever get away with this kind of cruelty. But the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. He needed to be cautious. The people behind this weren't just kids, they had resources, power, and a willingness to do anything to protect their own. Thomas knew that if he pushed too hard, too fast, they would retaliate. He couldn't let that happen. He needed to be smart, calculated. A moment later, his phone buzzed again. It was an email from the private investigator. "Thomas, I've got everything on the suspects. Names, family backgrounds, and some disturbing details about their involvement in other incidents at school. I'll send you the full report, but I suggest you meet with me in person. There's more to this than you realize." Thomas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and walked out the door. He knew this meeting would be crucial. It was time to take the next step. When he arrived at the investigator's office, he could tell something was off. The man behind the desk looked at him with a tense expression, as though he was about to drop a bombshell. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but sharp. "What aren't you telling me?" The investigator leaned forward, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "You're not going to like this, Thomas. The boys who attacked Aaron, they didn't act alone. They were part of something bigger. There's a group of kids who have been terrorizing other students for months, and it's all connected to their families. These aren't just bullies, they're being protected by people in power." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean, protected?" The investigator hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. "There are business deals, hush money, and even threats involved. These kids were given a free pass to hurt others, and their parents are using their influence to make sure nothing comes of it." Thomas clenched his fists. "So this goes all the way to the top," he muttered under his breath. The investigator nodded. "Exactly. And I think you already know the kind of people we're dealing with. These aren't just kids in trouble. This is a system of corruption, and it runs deep." The weight of the words hung heavy in the air. Thomas stood up, his mind racing. "We can't let this slide," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet fury. "These families need to be exposed. No more secrets." The investigator looked at him with a mixture of concern and respect. "You're sure you want to do this? You're not just going up against these kids, you're taking on some powerful people. You could make enemies who will stop at nothing to protect their own." Thomas nodded, his jaw set. "I'm not afraid of them. We're going to do what's right. If they think they can hide behind their money and power, they're wrong. This ends now." He turned to leave, but the investigator stopped him. "Be careful, Thomas. You're not just fighting for Aaron anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's ever been silenced by people like this." Thomas paused for a moment, taking in the gravity of the situation. He had already made his decision, but hearing it from someone else made it all the more real. As he walked out of the office and back into the world outside, he knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just a case of bullying, it was a battle for justice, and he wasn't going to back down until he had exposed the truth. He was in this fight to the end. The sound of his phone ringing broke the tense silence that had settled in the room. Thomas glanced at the screen. It was his lawyer. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Thomas." The lawyer's voice came through, steady but with a hint of urgency. "We've got a problem. I've just received word that the families involved have already started making moves. They're using their connections to discredit the case, trying to shut us down before we can get any further." Thomas's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean, discredit the case?" "They're sending people to the media, trying to twist the narrative," the lawyer replied. "They're painting Aaron and Lily as the aggressors, claiming that this was a misunderstanding. They've already reached out to a few outlets. They're going to try and bury this story." The blood in Thomas's veins turned cold. He had known this fight wouldn't be easy, but now he was facing a coordinated attack from those with more power and influence than he'd initially realized. "What can we do?" Thomas asked, his voice sharp. "We can't let them get away with this." "I've got a team looking into the media angle," the lawyer said. "We need to hit them back, publicly. If we let them control the story, they'll win. We need to make sure the truth comes out, and fast." Thomas paced the room, feeling a growing sense of urgency. This wasn't just about Aaron and Lily anymore. It was about exposing the system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unpunished. Get me everything. The evidence, the footage, the testimonies, everything we have. We need to be ready for this. If we're going to take them on, we need to go on the offensive." There was a pause on the other end, then a soft agreement. "I'll send everything over to you in the next hour. We'll strategize from there. But Thomas, be careful. These people will stop at nothing." "I'm not scared of them," Thomas said coldly. "I'm not going to let them use their power to sweep this under the rug. I gave my word to Lily and Aaron. I'm going to make sure they get justice." The lawyer hesitated for a moment longer. "I'll get back to you soon." The line went quiet, and Thomas was left standing in the room, his thoughts racing. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let these families, these people who thought their wealth and power could shield them, get away with this. He'd spent too much of his life building his empire to let it be destroyed by injustice. But now, more than ever, he understood the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about exposing a system that allowed the wealthy to hide behind their privilege, using their power to harm others without consequence. Thomas had spent his life navigating the world of business, but this was different. This was personal. This was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. He walked over to his desk, grabbing the papers and files he'd accumulated so far. There were names, addresses, details about the families involved, everything he needed to start putting together the puzzle. But there was still so much more to uncover. The boys who had attacked Aaron were just pawns in a much bigger game. It was time to take the fight to the people who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Thomas's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the private investigator. "We've got more intel. The families are connected through several business ventures. I'll send you the full report, but we need to move quickly. These people are already making moves to cover up the attack." Thomas took a deep breath and set his jaw. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. He had already committed to seeing this through, no matter how dangerous it became. This was bigger than just one family. It was about sending a message to everyone who thought they could use their power to hurt others without facing any consequences. He wasn't going to stand by and let that happen. He sat down at his desk, flipping through the investigator's report. He needed to know everything: how the families were connected, where the money was, and who was involved at every level. He wasn't just going to stop at the boys who had beaten Aaron. He was going to make sure that everyone responsible was exposed. As he read through the documents, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a fight for justice in a world where the rich and powerful thought they could do whatever they wanted, with no repercussions. He wasn't going to let them win. The more he learned, the more he realized how deep the corruption ran. But he also knew one thing for certain. If he stayed focused, if he kept pushing forward, he could make sure that Aaron and Lily received the justice they deserved. He wasn't going to let these people get away with what they had done. He stood up, grabbing his coat and his phone. It was time to take the next step. It was time to make them all face the consequences of their actions. He wasn't going to stop until the truth was revealed, no matter who tried to stop him. The day of the press conference arrived. Thomas stood in front of the mirror in his office, adjusting his tie, trying to steady his nerves. He had spent the last few days preparing, reviewing evidence, and coordinating with the lawyer and private investigator. Now, it was time to make his move. This wasn't just about Aaron and Lily anymore. This was about sending a message to everyone who believed they could use their power and influence to hurt others without consequence. The families involved in Aaron's attack had no idea what was coming. They had thought they could bury this, that their connections would shield them from the truth. But they were wrong. He had spent too long in a world where truth was often obscured by money and status, and he wasn't going to let that happen here. He was going to shine a light on everything: on the bullying, the cover-up, and the families that had protected these kids. He looked at his phone one last time, reading the message from his lawyer. "The press conference is set. Everything is in place. We're going public with the evidence." His hand tightened around the phone. This was it. No turning back now. Thomas walked out of his office and into the conference room where Lily and her brother, Aaron, waited. Lily was sitting in a chair, looking more composed than she had in days, but there was still a weariness in her eyes. Aaron, though still in recovery, was sitting up, the bandages on his head a stark reminder of the pain he had endured. But despite everything, there was a light in their eyes now, a hope that had been kindled by Thomas's promise to fight for them. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. Lily nodded, her fingers nervously twisting the corner of her brother's blanket. "We're ready," she said, her voice quiet but determined. Thomas gave her a reassuring smile. "Good. Let's do this." As they walked into the press conference room, the cameras flashed, and the reporters began shouting questions, eager to get a reaction, a soundbite, anything that would sell the story. But Thomas wasn't here to play their game. He was here to expose the truth. He stepped up to the podium, taking a deep breath, then addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. "I'm sure many of you have heard about the attack on Aaron, the bullying that led to this. But what you may not know is how deep this runs. What you may not know is the system that allowed it to happen and the families that have been protecting these bullies for far too long." The room fell silent. Reporters leaned in, scribbling notes, cameras rolling. "The truth is, this attack wasn't an isolated incident," Thomas continued. "This wasn't just a case of kids being kids. No, this was part of a pattern of abuse, a pattern that has been ignored by those in power. These children, these bullies, weren't acting alone. They were empowered by their families, by their wealth, by their position in this community." A murmur ran through the room. Thomas knew the gravity of what he was saying. He had the evidence, but he also knew the risks. The families involved would do anything to silence him, to make this go away. But he couldn't back down. "Not now. I've gathered all the evidence you need to see the truth," he said, his voice firm. "The names of the attackers, the connections to powerful families, the school's refusal to act, it's all here, and I'm going to make sure it's all exposed for the world to see." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This isn't just about Aaron and Lily anymore. This is about all the kids who have been silenced, who have suffered in the shadows. This is about a system that allows the rich and powerful to avoid the consequences of their actions. But not anymore, not on my watch." He looked directly at the reporters, his gaze unwavering. "The truth will come out. And those who thought they could get away with this will be held accountable." The room was silent for a moment. Then the questions began. The reporters were relentless, trying to dig deeper, asking for more details, more evidence. But Thomas stood firm. He knew they were looking for a scandal, a juicy story to sensationalize. But he wasn't here for that. He was here for justice. As the press conference continued, Thomas felt the tide shifting. The weight he had been carrying for so long, the frustration, the anger, the helplessness was starting to lift. It wasn't over, not yet. But this was the beginning of something bigger. This was the first step in taking down the people who had caused so much harm and who thought they could get away with it. When the conference finally ended, Thomas walked back to his office, his mind still racing. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The families would fight back. They'd do everything in their power to shut him down. But he wasn't afraid. He had already made his decision. He wasn't going to stop until the truth came out. He wasn't going to stop until Aaron and Lily and all the others who had been hurt got the justice they deserved. And he was willing to fight for it, no matter what. The following days after the press conference were a whirlwind. The media frenzy had only intensified, with reporters hounding Thomas for more details. The press was now focusing on the wealthy families involved, eager to uncover more about the corruption and the network that protected the bullies. Thomas could feel the pressure mounting, but he knew he was on the right path. His lawyer had assured him that the legal team was on top of things, preparing the next steps for the case. But there was still so much to do. The families of the boys who had attacked Aaron were starting to fight back, using their influence to plant stories in the media, trying to discredit Lily, Aaron, and even Thomas. It wasn't unexpected, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. Thomas couldn't help but feel a deep sense of anger whenever he read the new headlines. They were trying to turn the story around, twisting the facts to make it look like Aaron had somehow provoked the attack. They were painting him as a troubled child, blaming him for what had happened. But Thomas knew better. The truth was out there now. It was in the footage, in the testimonies, and in the countless hours of research that had been poured into the investigation. The truth was undeniable. The kids who had hurt Aaron were part of a much larger, insidious network. And they had been protected by their families, their money, and their status. The families were wealthy enough to make their problems disappear, but not this time, not anymore. It was late one evening when Thomas received another call from his lawyer. "Thomas, I have some new information," the lawyer said, his voice tight. "I've spoken to some of the other parents from the school. One of them is willing to talk, and they've confirmed everything. The boys involved in the attack have been part of a group that's been bullying other kids for years. It's all connected to their families and their wealth. But there's more." Thomas's heart raced. What more? The boys didn't just attack Aaron. They've been using their influence to intimidate the other kids and their families. They've been doing this for a long time, and now we have the proof. But we need to be careful. These families have power. They have resources. If we move too quickly, they'll try to shut us down. Thomas stood up from his desk, staring out the window as he processed the new information. This was bigger than he had thought. He knew these families were well connected, but now it was clear just how deep the corruption ran. They had been using their power to bully, intimidate, and get away with it. But it was over now. Thomas wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. "I don't care how powerful they are," Thomas said, his voice low and determined. "We're going to expose everything. I don't care if they have money or influence. What they did to Aaron and to all the other kids, it ends now." His lawyer was silent for a moment. "I know, Thomas, but we have to be strategic. We need to build a solid case and make sure we're ready. These people won't go down easily." "I understand," Thomas said, his jaw clenched. "We'll do it right, but we won't stop until they're held accountable." The conversation ended, and Thomas was left alone with his thoughts. His resolve was stronger than ever. The truth was out, but now he had to make sure that the system would act on it. The law, the media, the public, they all had to see what was really happening. But it wasn't going to be easy. As the days passed, more and more details came to light. The bullying had been going on for years, with the boys using their wealth and status to shield themselves from any consequences. The stories from other victims began to surface, and Thomas knew they were just the beginning. The press was all over the story now, and the public was starting to rally behind Aaron and Lily. The pressure was building, and the families involved in the attack knew they were losing control. They tried to use their influence to sway the narrative, but it was clear that the tide was turning. People were starting to see the truth. They couldn't hide behind their wealth anymore. One evening, as Thomas prepared for another round of media interviews, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Lily. "Mr. Anderson, Aaron is awake. He's asking for you." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He immediately texted back, "I'll be there as soon as I can." He left his office, his mind racing. Aaron was awake. That was a huge step forward. He could finally talk to him, get the truth from him directly. Maybe this would be the breakthrough they needed. When he arrived at the hospital, Lily was waiting outside Aaron's room. Her face lit up when she saw him. "He's awake," she said, her voice full of emotion. "He wants to talk to you." Thomas followed her into the room, where Aaron was sitting up in bed, his face pale but alert. His bandages were still fresh, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Aaron looked up at Thomas, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for helping us." His resolve was stronger than ever. The truth was out, but now he had to make sure that the system would act on it. The law, the media, the public, they all had to see what was really happening. But it wasn't going to be easy. As the days passed, more and more details came to light. The bullying had been going on for years, with the boys using their wealth and status to shield themselves from any consequences. There was still a long road ahead, but they were finally on the right path. The truth was out, and it wasn't going anywhere. And Thomas was going to make sure of it. Weeks had passed since the press conference, and the momentum had not slowed. The media coverage had only grown more intense, and public opinion was on their side. The families of the boys who had attacked Aaron were no longer able to hide behind their wealth and influence. Investigations were underway, and the truth had come out, piece by piece. Aaron's injuries had healed physically, but the emotional toll was still visible in his eyes. He had become stronger, more resilient, and his bond with his sister, Lily, had only deepened. Thomas had kept his word. He had been there for them every step of the way, not just as a benefactor, but as a protector, a true ally. But the real battle had just begun. The legal fight had reached its climax, and as the day of the court hearing approached, the stakes were higher than ever. The powerful families were scrambling, doing everything they could to suppress the truth and protect their children. They had tried to bury the case, spin the media, and use their connections to intimidate witnesses, but Thomas was unwavering. He had fought too hard, and the truth could not be silenced anymore. On the morning of the hearing, Thomas stood outside the courthouse, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the massive building. He knew what was at stake. This was more than just a case of bullying. This was about exposing a system of power, privilege, and corruption that had gone unchecked for far too long. The air was thick with tension as the media gathered outside, waiting for the courtroom doors to open. The families involved were already inside, their expensive lawyers by their sides, doing everything they could to ensure a favorable outcome. But Thomas wasn't worried about them. He had faith in the truth. As he walked into the courthouse, Lily and Aaron were with him, their presence a quiet reminder of why he had fought so hard. The legal team had been working relentlessly to build the strongest case possible, and now it was time to see it through. As the hearing began, the courtroom was filled with spectators, some sympathetic to Aaron and Lily, others hoping to see the case go in favor of the wealthy families. Thomas sat at the front, his eyes focused on the judge. The proceedings began, and the room fell silent as the evidence was presented. Video footage of the attack, testimonies from the witnesses, and the damning report from the investigator, everything had been laid out, piece by piece. The defense tried to argue that Aaron had somehow provoked the situation, that he was a troublemaker, but the evidence spoke for itself. The prosecution presented the truth, how the bullying had been a pattern, how the families had covered it up, how power and privilege had protected those responsible. It was undeniable. The defense's case crumbled under the weight of the truth. The lies and the manipulation no longer had a place in this courtroom. As the final arguments were made, Thomas couldn't help but glance at Lily and Aaron. They had been through so much, and yet they were still standing strong. They had come so far from that night of fear and uncertainty. They had shown bravery that could never be measured. Finally, the moment of judgment came. The judge stood, and the room held its collective breath. Based on the evidence presented, the judge said, his voice steady, and the testimony of the witnesses, the court finds the defendants guilty of bullying and physical assault. The families involved will be held accountable, and a full investigation will be launched into the cover-up. A wave of relief swept through the room. Lily's eyes welled with tears, and Aaron's face broke into a smile. For the first time in weeks, they felt like they could breathe again. The families who had tried to hide behind their power were now facing the consequences of their actions. They had been exposed for what they truly were, people who thought they were untouchable, but who had been brought down by the truth. Thomas stood up, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't just a victory for Aaron and Lily, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been hurt by the system. They had fought back, and they had won. The judge's gavel came down, sealing the verdict. The room erupted into applause, and Thomas turned to Lily and Aaron. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Lily smiled, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. We couldn't have done this without you." Thomas smiled back, his heart full. "No, you did it. You're the ones who showed me what real strength is. You're the ones who made all of this possible." The journey had been long, but it was finally over. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. The bullies who thought they could get away with their actions had been held accountable, and the families who had tried to cover it up had been exposed. But beyond the legal victory, there was something more important. Aaron and Lily had found their voice. They had shown the world that no one should be silenced, no one should be ignored. As they walked out of the courthouse together, side by side, Thomas knew that this was only the beginning for them. They had a future ahead of them, one filled with endless possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt hopeful. The world wasn't perfect, but moments like this, moments of real change, made it all worthwhile. They had fought for justice, and they had won. This powerful story follows the journey of a young boy named Aaron and his sister Lily, who find themselves caught in a system of bullying and corruption, hidden behind the wealth and influence of their attackers. Through their journey, the strength of the human spirit shines as Aaron and Lily fight for justice, with the help of a determined ally. This compelling tale highlights the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. As the story unfolds, the truth about a powerful network that shields its privileged members is revealed, showing the lengths these families will go to maintain their control. With the courage of a determined billionaire, the truth is exposed in a dramatic courtroom battle. This black story is not just about one family's fight for justice, but about exposing a system that has allowed such cruelty to thrive. Throughout the story, the theme of resilience and justice takes center stage as Aaron and Lily's story captures the hearts of everyone who hears it. If you are looking for powerful black stories that inspire change and speak truth to power, this is one that will leave a lasting impression. The resolution of this black story is a triumph over adversity, showing that no matter how powerful the oppressors may seem, truth and justice will always prevail.